What's up guys, it's Billy Quick, back with another Altered TCG video, and today I'm going to be talking about Lindiwe, which is my favorite hero right now, and honestly I think Lindiwe is a little bit underrated, and I'll get into that in just a second, but before we talk about Lindiwe, I'm just going to tell you what we're going to be covering in this video to give you an idea. Feel free to skip ahead, but we're going to be talking about why I think Lindiwe is good. We're going to be talking about some simple sequencing and things that you can be doing while playing Lindiwe that can improve your gameplay, and just general tips for playing other altered heroes. We're going to talk about some of the best cards in the list, my current list, and the best cards in the deck. And then just some tips for each hero or faction that you play against, some uniques to look out for, and some closing thoughts. So let's get into it. So the idea for this video sprouted from last night. I played in my LGS's constructed format. I went undefeated, and I've been playing Lindiwe for several weeks now on Board Game Arena. I have a pretty solid win rate. I think Lindiwe is underrated because she is the simplest form of both an enabler and a payoff. If you're new to trading card games, you might not know what those terms mean, so I'll try to break it down for you. An enabler is something that gives you... Actually, I'll give you an example. So for Lindiwe, she can produce a token, a character for you, either for free or for 1 mana. Okay, so this enables your strategy in this deck where Lindiwe wants to simply sacrifice things. Now, since she can create a character that you can sacrifice, that is enabling your strategy. You can also have the payoff side of Lindiwe, which is the Maw says when you sacrifice something, you get boosts. So it is paying you off or rewarding you for sacrificing things. So like I said, in the simplest form, Lindiwe is an enabler and a payoff on one hero. Most heroes are either one or the other, or a watered down form of this. Lindiwe, I think, is quite powerful in that she can do both well. I think paying 1 mana when you're not the first player is a relatively big downside, but my theory is maybe with support that's coming for sacrifice inevitably, in playtesting they deemed it was too powerful to make it for free. So here's to hoping in that case. But to compare it to some meta heroes like Sigismar and Afanis, these two heroes are either one or the other. Sigismar is an enabler. It doesn't reward you for doing anything. Sigismar just makes tokens. That's all Sigismar does. And it's very powerful. Sigismar is one of the best decks in the format, or one of the best decks in Altered for a reason. Sigismar pressures a lane with literally no investment. He is forcing you to answer this token or that expedition is advancing, quite simply. It doesn't get more simple than that. And then Afanis is a payoff. Afanis is another one of the best decks right now in Altered, and Afanis rewards you for playing spells. Makes your characters bigger, and in most other card games they refer to this as going tall or going big, if you will. And that's just, you play 1 or 2 characters and then you just play a bunch of spells, and Afanis rewards you for doing so. And that's one of the reasons why I think Lindiwe is one of my favorite characters, is that she has that flexibility. If you need a character or if you need a payoff, you can make the choice. I find Lindiwe to be quite compelling as a deck builder myself, because in other card games like Magic, I am fond of what is referred to as a mid-range deck, which generally gives you a lot of options. There's high-value cards, meaning they're low mana cost, but they do something efficiently. There's also usually a lot of interesting decisions to be made, like, do I want to answer this character that my opponent's played, or do I want to advance my own board state? And I've been really enjoying that with Lindiwe. So I enjoyed the puzzle solving, the problem solving, or the puzzles that you can find yourself in. All right, so next I want to talk about sequencing. Now, sequencing is really important no matter what deck you play in Altered, but it's pivotal in Lindiwe. Lindiwe has a lot of cheap, or typically plays a lot of cheap characters, and I'll go over my list, some of the best cards in the list in just a minute. But sequencing is very important because you want to have all of the information before you start committing your Maw, especially. So like I said earlier, Lindiwe can create a character, create a Maw that pays you off for sacrificing. Granted, a lot of these effects can be quite expensive. Looking at some of the cards in the deck, which I'll tease to now, Boom is a good example, in that it costs 3 mana. Now Boom, you do have to sacrifice a character to use it. Sometimes it's right to create Maw and then sacrifice it to Boom to deal with a high value card on your opponent's side. It's really important to know when to deploy your Maw, because your Maw can be your highest value character that you play on a given turn, but Maw is very susceptible to removal. Maw can be off you go'd, no matter how big your Maw gets, it can be off you go'd. It can be intimidated, which is a popular Bravos removal spell. It can be put to sleep. And you've spent all of these resources, or your entire turn, maybe building up this Maw, only for it to be dealt with. So sequencing is super important in Lindiwe. You don't want to expose your Maw unless you absolutely have to, or you need it for any given reason. Now, I've talked about this in some of my previous videos, but here's my current list, and I've been doing quite well with it. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. Last night I played at my LGS. I went undefeated. I beat several what people would consider meta decks. In the first round, I beat Afanis and Sinka. In the second round, I beat Fen and Crowbar. And the third round, I beat Kojo and Buddha, which the Afanis match was quite sweaty. I have played against that player many times at the shop, and they have beat me every time except last night. So it was a big win to come out on top there for me. I was very excited. Now, I'm playing some untraditional or non-traditional cards in this list. For example, most players in Ysmir right now are playing a very popular card called Small Step Giant Leap. This card is currently on the watch list by Equinox. I'm expecting this card to get errated or suspended or dealt with in some way. I don't find this card to be particularly interesting, so I'm just kind of getting ahead of what they're going to end up doing with that card. Like I said, I expect it to be dealt with, so I'm getting ahead of it, and since I don't find it satisfying as a gameplay mechanic, I'm just foregoing the effect. So I'm playing Magical Trainings, and that is also something you don't often find, but that's kind of my replacement. It's a great tempo play. For 1 mana, you draw a card, and card advantage in Altered is just so important because every single card is gas, unlike other card games like Magic the Gathering, one of the most popular card games that exists. Card advantage is good, but typically it's better in high quantities. In Altered, drawing 1 card is very, very beneficial because it's going to be something you can play or something to consider. Now, in Lindiwe, your best cards are, first of all, Moonlight Jellyfish. And look at this card. It's absolutely adorable. How could you not want to play this card? It provides excellent tempo, and it's so cute. It also provides card advantage. So there's a lot to like about this card. One of Lindiwe's next best cards is Baba's Isba. Now, at first, when I was beginning to play Altered and picking up Lindiwe, I didn't understand why Baba's Isba and this After You mechanic was so important to the deck, and I almost considered cutting it. Now that I've played Lindiwe for 5 weeks or so, I totally get it, and I understand why they play the rare version. It's really important on your first turn or maybe your second turn of the game to be able to play this Baba's Isba for 2 mana, draw a card right away, which is an excellent ability on the Baba's Isba, and then have another play, because if you're playing the not rare version, the common version is 3 mana rather than 2. And taking your first turn off to just play a permanent and not advance an expedition can put you pretty far behind in Lindiwe, because oftentimes you're just trading 1 for 1 until you get to later in the game where you can make a much more powerful play with the next card that we're going to talk about, which is Moth Lantern. And now Moth Lantern is in a similar space where the common version is 3 mana from hand, 2 mana from reserve. And the rare version, being 2 mana, is a similar idea. You want to be able to play a cheap character and then follow it up with a Moth Lantern. And later in the game, it often comes up where Moth Lantern doesn't actually advance your expedition. Sometimes you'll just use it to tie a lane or as a sacrifice to grow your Maw to win that lane. And then you'll just have Moth Lantern on the next turn, where you'll get even more value out of the card. Now, if you ever end up in a situation where you can have multiple Moth Lanterns in play, especially on the same side, and maybe Abba's Isba or some other form of sacrifice, you can grow a massive board. The card is absolutely bonkers late in the game. So this card, I think it is easily worth the rare slot just for the mana reduction. And if playing 15 years of Magic has taught me anything, 2 mana is a lot less mana than 3, right? It's 33%, or I'm not a statistician. It's a lot less mana. Now onto my favorite card in the deck, that's Boom. Now this is a versatile removal spell. It can deal with a permanent, which is excellent. It is a enabler for your Maw. You get to sacrifice a character to deal with something, which is very valuable for you. And I would love to be able to play 3 Booms, but it doesn't often come up where this 3 mana removal spell is the most efficient play to make on a given turn. So if you're playing 3, in my experience, I have played 3, you're often mana-ing more than 1 Boom a game. And now in its place of the 3rd Boom, I'm playing one of my pet cards, which is Amarok. And it's still unclear to me if this card is good, but I love it. The art is so nice and the effect is cool. It's what I would consider a free sacrifice outlet in that you can just play a character into its expedition and sacrifice it without paying a cost or doing anything else to get your sacrifice payoff. It can be a pretty big tempo play, especially on turn 4 or 5 where you have a lot of mana, to play Amarok in an expedition by itself, and then follow it up with a 1 mana spell like a Jellyfish or a Studious Disciple, and get some benefit, maybe buffing your Maw. In the case of the Jellyfish, you can actually draw a card for not much mana and really provide a lot of tempo in case you need a pivotal moment to off you go or boom. So I love Amarok. I don't know if it's good. I'm just playing it as a one of, as you've seen in my list. I think that's the most important pieces of my list, but something I wanted to talk about is some uniques to look out for. So if you're building Lindiwe, what I would recommend is just low-cost characters that do something for value. Maybe if you can find something that says, when I'm sacrificed, that's even better. Notably, the Moonlight Jellyfish uniques, I believe, are currently all suspended. So Moonlight Jellyfish, like I mentioned before, absolute gas. It is one of the best cards in your deck. So I'm hard-pressed to replace it at rare anyway. So what I would look out for is, 1 and 2 mana characters that do something when they're sacrificed, or they provide you a way to sacrifice things. I'm playing these 2 uniques, and this Ordish Trooper has been an absolute powerhouse in my deck. I absolutely love this card. The stats are great. It's just, I'm sure there are better uniques, but this is what I have access to. So, and the Stargazer I'm playing because it doesn't often get its effects, but it does allow me to play 3 magical trainings and 3 off you goes, and sometimes get value out of those, because off you go from reserve is very expensive and often not worth it. So being able to discard it or return it to your hand is excellent in this deck. And I don't have a 3rd playable Ysmir unique, so this is what I'm working with. I also wanted to mention one small tip about playing Lindiwe in paper. It's really important to notice where your companion side is. Not a lot of heroes care about your companion side, so it's pivotal that when you sit down to play against your opponent, you recognize where your companion side is, because it has screwed me a few times. So a bit of a beginner tip, but just keep an eye out for that. Now, I also wanted to talk about some tips for each faction and each hero that you're going to play against when you're playing Lindiwe. So just to start off with a couple of the meta choices and some of the decks you may run into the most, Afanis and Sinka, considered one of the best decks right now. Removal against Afanis and Sinka, like Off You Go and Boom, which I've touched on, are easily your best cards in this matchup. The way they get advantage in their deck is by playing characters like the Mage Dancer and playing spells to buff it up. So having cards like Off You Go or Boom that deal with these very well. I mean, Boom is much better because it is gone forever, but Off You Go at least deals with it if you're able to get the tempo and the sequencing that you need, in which they can't play the Mage Dancer again and then buff it up again. But removal against Afanis, very good. One side note is, most Afanis decks, or most of the ones that I have played against, are currently playing the Nilam Withered Tree permanent, and this permanent is a little bit of a bait for removal. I wouldn't recommend booming this most of the time. Granted, your situation will likely be different, but in my experience, booming the Withered Tree is not as valuable as just dealing with a character that Afanis can buff up. So that's what I would recommend for Afanis. Removal is your best friend, and you're really just trading 1-for-1s most of the game until you're able to pressure both sides with the Moth Lantern or your Maw. Now moving on to one of the next most popular decks. Sorry, I have a cat on my lap now. Your single target removal is not going to be very good against Sigismar, but your board wipes, as what they would call it in other card games, like Blizzard, are going to be excellent. So if you ever see Blizzard and you're paired up against Sigismar, you're very inclined to keep that card. I highly, highly, highly recommend not mana-ing a Blizzard effect or a Blizzard card against Sigismar. It is very often that you'll get to turn 7 or 8 in the game and Blizzard will just win you the game. So that is what I recommend. Sigismar is going to be a tough matchup. They apply a lot of pressure for not much mana, and they go wide, which is what a lot of people in the card game community call it, when you play a bunch of tokens and you spread out your stats across many characters. So Blizzard, easily your best card in that matchup. Besides that, we've already talked about sequencing, but sequencing is critical in any matchup, but especially against Sigismar. They have pretty efficient removal in the form of teamwork training. And then I probably won't cover more specific hero matchups, just because I'm already pretty over on time here. Now, for Bravos, I'd recommend keeping up your card advantage. So anything that can draw you more cards, that being Jellyfish, Baba's Isbas, your Gift of Selves, these things are going to be pretty important because they're going to be putting a lot of pressure on you in most Bravos decks. So being able to just play more cards and have more options to deal with these things is pretty important. Granted, that's important for most matchups, but especially against Bravos, where they're not relying as heavily on their removal. So having options to react to what they're doing is pretty important. Now onto Muna, which is the green faction. Removal is your best friend. A lot of the time, they're just trying to play an anchored character or play a high value character. Let's think Daughter of Yggdrasil, for example. This is a beefed up character that often draws you a card, which is, great. But it's easily dealt with an off you go, especially when played from reserve where there's no downside. And I've played Muna matchups with more removal in my deck, where I've played versions with the Anubis, the rare faction shifted Anubis in Ysmir, to make people sacrifice characters. That card, excellent against Muna. So if you're LGS that has a lot of Muna players, then I would highly recommend playing Anubis. It is very powerful against them. More removal, single target removal is very good against the green faction. Now onto Axiom. I'd recommend trading 1-for-1 against Axiom most of the time. It might be difficult to 2-0 an Axiom player unless they're committing with a permanent. In a game against Traced, for example, the longer the game goes on, you are going to get buried in card advantage. So you kind of want to beat Trace early by trading 1-for-1s and then trying to push for a 2-0 as Trace comes online or shortly after. And then for Lyra, the most popular hero in that faction is Finn, and some would argue that is the only playable hero in that faction. Really pay attention to Finn's reserve, because a lot of the cards will have support abilities that you may not recognize or realize that they can take advantage of. Granted, Finn doesn't have as many options as most other decks because they don't get the choice when putting back cards into their mana. They are mostly playing face up. Half the cards that they can play with are in their reserve. So paying attention to the reserve is very critical. Cards like Tooth Fairy are going to be your best friend because you can deal with their highest value cards. All right, and then on to my closing thoughts. I think Lindiwe is underrated. I mentioned this before. As we continue to get more sacrifice support, inevitably, maybe in this next set, hopefully, we should expect to see Lindiwe become more powerful, have more options, and react to what the meta is doing. If we somehow manage to get some character in Ysmir that can ready your hero or untap it, if you will, that would be so good for Lindiwe. With how powerful a card like Moth Lantern is, I'm really hopeful to see more sacrifice that pushes Lindiwe in a direction of being a prominent meta deck. I think Lindiwe is inevitable as being a playable card as long as they continue to print sacrifice effects and payoff for sacrifice effects, just because she is an enabler and a payoff, like I've said. So I'm looking forward to seeing more Lindiwe support, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me rant about my favorite deck. Go try her!